TNKR Media. Damned if you do, damned if you don't, regardless which side of the political spectrum you're on, as a woman at least.
Whether you're on the right or whether or not you're on the left or whatever in between as a woman, you get 10 times the shit for half the opinion.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater Dubé, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater Dubé, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
Welcome back to an all-new episode of The Goldwaters, and we're here with Dr. Sam. Hi, Dr. Sam.
Hi, Dan. How's it going?
Good. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
We're going to come back a little bit to a topic we've done in previous shows, and that is bullying and cyberbullying, but we're going to take a bit of a different angle, and we're going to talk about social networks and network theory, and float the idea that maybe these networks get more toxic as they grow. Is this something you've been thinking about?
It is something I've been thinking about. I just did a radio interview about this a couple of weeks ago, and it comes up quite a lot. We hear more and more about cyberbullying, hear more and more about virtue signaling online and people and the sort of mob mentality that ends up taking over. And a lot of people are just describing the online atmosphere as really quite toxic, to the point that several prominent people are taking breaks from their online profiles, despite the professional advantages it can give them to stay online. They're choosing to opt out.
It's really hard to be a centrist sometimes these days, but our guest this week is probably someone who's around the political center. And our guest, Jen Gerson, has a theory, and that theory has to do with Dunbar's theory. We're going to get into a lot about that in the podcast today. Does a network become more toxic as it grows? And so Jen is a commentator based in Calgary, Canada. She writes for Maclean's magazine, The Walrus, and she co-hosts a podcast called OPPO, OPPO, with Justin Ling on the Canada Land Network, if you want to check that out. And so Jen will join us very shortly. And Sam, hopefully we're going to get to the bottom of exactly what is going on some of these social networks, and why the medium itself can be producing some pretty monstrous people.
Well, I think it's definitely going to make for an interesting conversation. I'm not sure if we can get to all the answers, but we're sure going to give it a go.
Let's dive right in. Jen Gerson on the Goldwaters.
All right, Jen, lovely to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me.
I thought we would get going by talking a bit about the perils of being online. Twitter can be a toxic, soul-draining place where everyone fights, the news is always bad, but it can definitely be worse for some people than for others. And you know all about this. On a recent episode of Canada Land, your co-host and your boss talked about how you get far more heat, and that's actually far more brutal than your male co-host, Justin. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic. I think that Twitter brings out the absolute worst angels of everybody's nature on every single level. So, if there is an inherent sexist bias against women, if there's an inherent bias against progressives or conservatives, if there's an inherent bias against people of color, Twitter has this weird way of amplifying that to an extraordinary degree. So, I can have a one-on-one conversation with lots of people whom I just passionately dislike on Twitter, and vice versa. And we can have these wonderful, constructive conversations where we're connecting as humans who just happen to disagree on an issue. And then you somehow get on Twitter and it's vile, it's vitriolic, it's toxic. You can no longer have an exchange with them. And the sort of underlying social dynamics about the way we treat women and the way we treat people of color seem only to be amplified on that medium. And it's fascinating to watch, but it's also horrible to participate in.
Right, no doubt. And, I just wanted to follow up, what do you think accounts for these differences? To go back to your experience on Canada Land, there was where everything seemed to have started is that you had, you made a small error, we all do, in terms of mixing up, I think you mixed up the premiers, Jacques Parizeau with René Levesque on the show. Small glitch, but then the audience you got a ton of angry emails and comments, and people just really, mobbed you in this case and really gave a lot of hateful comments. Whereas your co-host, Justin, who's obviously male, even when he's made little mistakes or he's made strong comments, he hasn't gotten the same treatment. His treatment has been much more respectful. So when you say that things can be really amplified in terms of people's prejudices, how, would you tell me a little bit more about that? How far do you think this goes?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I'll kind of clarify a little bit on that point, is that it wasn't just, one mistake in which I got piled on. What my boss, Jesse, was responding to and my co-host, Justin, were responding to was this trend or this habit that had been building and getting worse and worse and worse with each successive episode of OPPO that we were doing, where they were noticing that people, particularly from the left of the spectrum, were just piling on, getting nastier and nastier and nastier with every 2-week episode that we put out. And Jesse was, I think, trying to put an end to that because he was becoming very conscious of just how ugly it was getting. And it's a bit of an interesting thing because Canadaland generally has a pretty progressive audience, but OPPO is one of those podcasts where I'm kind of brought on as the pet conservative, so to speak, even though I'm not particularly conservative by most conservative standards. But anyway, so I'm kind of brought in there to challenge Justin on some of his slightly more leftist leanings, but neither of us are dogmatic, and certainly neither of us are partisan. But what we found is that when you put me in an environment where I was, my viewpoints were being exposed to progressive audience members, they were lashing out at me as opposed to Justin, and there were political reasons for that. But there was also a weird, very sexist undertone to a lot of these comments. The tone was just fundamentally different. I mean, people disagreed with Justin, and they would disagree with him on a point or on an intellectual point. But when they hated on me or they disagreed with me, it was like, you're a stupid idiot. You belong in the kitchen barefoot. You're a stupid cunt. You're a dumb. There was an inherent sexism that was being revealed by the people who were coming after me that went above and beyond the mere ideological disagreements. So I find that particularly interesting. I mean, as someone who's a little bit further to the right on the political spectrum, although I think I'm probably center right, the way that there's this weird dynamic among a certain subset of very progressive men who call themselves feminists and say they believe in equal rights for women, and it's just totally at odds with the way they respond or deal with women they disagree with, right? It's like all of the inherent misogyny and sexism of society that they've internalized seems to be acceptable when they are using it or channeling it towards women who are on the more conservative side of the political spectrum. It's just a really bizarre dynamic. And likewise, of course, you have very awful conservative men or men who are involved in like the men's rights movements who are just vicious and nasty to progressive women online. So it's just the dynamics are slightly different, but they're both there.
It's end up feeling kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't, regardless which side of the political spectrum you're on. As a woman, at least.
Yeah, this is what I find so fascinating and why I find it so frustrating, is that it's not even necessarily about how it affects me personally. It's about the environment that this sort of behavior and these sorts of attitudes create for women online. And I've said this before, is that whether you're political, whether you're on the right or whether or not you're on the left or whatever in between as a woman, you get 10 times the shit for half the opinion as a comparable man would. And it doesn't really matter what opinion it is. So I find that overall it just it creates this particularly toxic environment for women in which women are much more afraid to express controversial opinions because they know the backlash they're going to get for it is going to be so much worse. And that has a really punitive effect on the overall discourse because it means increasingly women's voices aren't being heard.
Do you feel that that's affected how you end up speaking in the public forum or presenting yourself online, having this sort of vitriolic backlash that you find that you end up that you start censoring yourself more?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I can tell you that I'm far less aggressive and I'm far less fighty on Twitter now than I was even 2 or 3 years ago. Because as my profile's increased, this dynamic has only accelerated. Like the dynamic has actually only become exponentially worse as my profile has grown. So I have to be more cautious now than I was 3, 4, 5 years ago. I can't get into the fights that I was getting into because whereas, even 5 years ago, if I got into a fight on Twitter, it didn't really matter that much. And it would maybe wind up, even at worst, being a fight between 3 or 4 other people. And it would be kind of nasty and I'd be upset for a day and I'd get over it. Now, if I get into a fight online, I've got, like 17,000 Twitter followers. So it just winds up being a dog pile. And you can't, when you're kind of in the middle of a dog pile, you can't even really respond. You can't have a conversation. You can't apologize. You can't backtrack. You can't inject nuance or subtlety to the opinion because it winds up having, as I said, an exponential effect where the more people who get dragged into the dog pile, the more people you're having a conversation with, the more people get drawn into the fight. So it winds up with you being a fight between not you, but between, 500 people. And you can't there's no way to go from there, right?
Right. And this hasn't been your experience when you've been talking to, let's say, men or people on the other side of the political spectrum in person.
Oh gosh, no. I mean, that's the funny thing about all of this, is that I can sit and have fantastic conversations with people who are like straight out communists. And when we're talking one-on-one in private, we have wonderful conversations. We challenge each other on all of this stuff. But that brings us to the other element of this dynamic that makes Twitter in particular so toxic, is the degree to which it's performative. I mean, people use the word virtue signaling. I know people on the left hate the word virtue signaling and basically are like, that's Nazi code word. It isn't. People on the right virtue signal too. The problem with the medium, as far as I can tell, is that it's not even that you're having a conversation with people you disagree with or agree with or don't. It's that the conversations you're having are about engaging in a performance to your own followers and your own base. So in other words, Twitter has a way of turning us all into politicians. We're no longer talking to people, we're talking at people in order to gain the validation of likes. And in order to do that, we have to constantly simplify our message and tailor it to our respective ideological bases in order to succeed. That's the Twitter strategy. That's how you win at Twitter. And it's a poisonous approach to discourse. You can't have conversations on there anymore.
Let me ask you something. I was just curious when I was listening to Canada Land, and I was listening to the response, and Justin and your boss were sort of talking about what happened and pleading with the audience to be more respectful and be more reasonable with you, which is an obvious thing to ask people to do, and be more thoughtful. I'm just curious, just as I was listening to, why didn't you address the audience in that context?
I wasn't even asked about that particular segment. Justin and Jesse did that without even running it by me, which I thought was kind of interesting. I think that and this is the other problem that you run into when you sort of get mobbed online, and I've been through these mobs like half a dozen times now. I've forgotten most of them now. But defending yourself is pointless. Defending yourself is useless. Even if you're being mobbed, honestly, I tell people this: don't apologize, because there's it only makes it worse. Like everything that you can do, defending yourself, not defending yourself, apologizing, not apologizing, you can't win when you're in one of these dynamics. There is nothing you can say or do.
So you just play dead.
Yeah, you just got to play dead. That's all you can do. And you just have to walk away and turn off your phone. And basically it's like it becomes almost like a Keynesian animal spirit, right? I mean, like the force of nature just has to flow over you and move on, and people get bored. And then you get back on Twitter a couple of days later and it's fine. But that's the only survival strategy, right? I've tried being mobbed and sort of fighting back or arguing, and it's like throwing firewood onto a fire. That's all it is. So, for me to go on there, I think, and try to defend myself would only make it worse. I don't think I would have the moral authority to try and encourage people to be more thoughtful. But when, again, it's two men who are largely talking to, and let's also be honest, most of my nastiest critics online are young men. So there's an element of sexual tension and sexual frustration at play here, deep under the surface. But when you have sort of men of about the same age who are of the same ideological bent, sort of telling their own side, hey guys, you guys are out of line, that actually carries much more moral weight and moral authority than Jen Gerson, who's basically a fascist, saying, please be nice to me, right?
Right. Okay, so in the end, it's almost like you have to play into the same game, where it becomes, if I'm going to be getting misogynist comments from men, then at some point I need to have, there's no use in defending myself, because it's just they're going to pile on more. So the only way out of it is either play dead and or get other men with some level of authority to keep their tribe, well, if you can say their tribe, keep other men in check.
Yeah, I mean, but it's not even just men. And this is the other thing that I kind of keep on trying to intimate to people, is that the only way out of the current quagmire is that we have to start calling out our own tribes. So, I have a certain sort of intellectual milieu and tribe on and offline, right? The only way we actually address the overall culture issue that we've created is if we acknowledge that by engaging in these types of mobby tactics, we're actually creating a corrosive environment, not just for the people that we disagree with, but also for the people we agree with. It's a counterproductive strategy that actually hurts our points of view and our positions and our moral authority. So one of the most effective ways I think that we can actually address that culture is if we all get into the habit of quietly calling in our own tribe. So if there's somebody who's in my sort of ideological or professional network whom I think is behaving badly, it's kind of incumbent on me towards somebody else, even someone I disagree with. It's incumbent on me to sort of step up and say, you know what, I actually think you're out of line. I think that you're being unfair here. And I think that maybe you need to step back. And maybe it'll have an effect and maybe it won't. But I think that that's what we all have to sort of get into the habit of doing.
Well, let me ask you something, because it's an interesting point that you bring up, that we need to keep people in our tribes in check in some way to create more civil dialogue and to be sure that things, the discussions move forward and we can actually make some sort of progress. But there's a balance, of course, between that. I'm curious what you think about this in terms of kind of feeding into call-out culture and having a more constructive dialogue. So if you do feel that somebody in your tribe, let's say, is unnecessarily vilifying somebody else, then what do you think the best medium would be to be able to communicate with them to say, Wola, like, simmer down, you're being a little unfair, let's appreciate some nuance?
I think that I hate call-out culture. I think it contributes to the corrosive mob effect that I'm talking about. I think that the more effective approach is to generally try to have that conversation privately or to send someone a note privately. Because I think that when people get a note privately from someone on their own side, they're far less likely to feel attacked and defensive. And they're far more likely to be like, okay, yeah, I guess, blah, blah, blah. But the second you make it public, well, now all of a sudden you're engaging in a performance, right? You're engaging in a performance for the benefit of your own base. And so it comes across as disingenuous.
Right. And then the person may feel that they have to perform back in order to defend themselves or risk being shunned by their entire tribe.
Yeah, exactly. So people tend to double down when you call them out publicly. Generally speaking, when you call them out publicly, you shut down conversation, you shut down dialogue, and people tend to double down and harden on their positions. It has exactly the opposite effect of what you're looking for, which is why Twitter now is such a toxic and corrosive and politicized place.
Mm-hmm. Well, that leads really nicely into something that you've brought up before, which is the Dunbar number, in terms of maybe you can explain a little bit what the Dunbar number is, and then we'll kind of jump in and how that may be related to, how we interact with people online.
Sure. So let me sort of draw a general comparison about how my relationship with Twitter changed. I mean, I was probably one of the earlier adopters with Twitter. And when I was first on there, and of course I had a couple hundred followers and I was following a couple hundred people, it actually really was a social network, right? It was something that you got on and you had conversations with people and even debates with people. And it was totally fine to have those conversations and debates. But when, I continued on in journalism and of course my profile grew because that's the unfortunate consequence of being in journalism, I went from having a couple hundred followers to a couple thousand followers to tens of thousands of followers, or I guess in my case, it doesn't matter. It's more than 10,000 followers. My whole relationship with the medium fundamentally changed as my profile grew and my follower count went up. Because you can have a conversation when you have a couple hundred followers. Once you get past a thousand followers, though, it's no longer a social network, it's a broadcast medium. And you can no longer have conversations because you can't thread a conversation in a meaningful way. It just winds up being a pylon. So your whole relationship to it as a medium has to change. And it goes back to the whole, okay, so what's the number at which it changes? Well, that kind of brings us to a corollary of the Dunbar number, which the Dunbar number is basically suggests that, human primates can only really have meaningful social interactions with about 150 other people. And that once you get above 150 people, group cohesion fundamentally breaks down, absent some pretty restrictive controls on social identity, right? So I don't think my experience with Twitter tracks perfectly with the Dunbar number, unless you sort of think about, okay, well, who's on Twitter at any given time? But generally, I found that once your tribe gets larger than 150 online, and I mean tribe is in not just your follower count, I mean tribe is in the number of people who you're regularly interacting with every day. Once that tribe expands to 150, it no longer is a social interaction anymore. It's not a social network. It's a broadcast medium.
And in that case, you find that the vitriol starts to increase and the ability to have nuanced conversations starts to drop. Has that been your experience?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens. And I mean, there's another thing that starts to happen and again, I say this as someone who's a quote unquote public figure in a very, very mean sense. I'm a somewhat well-known Canadian journalist. Okay, so keep understand the frame I'm putting this in. It's not an egotistical frame, but the second you start to become more well-known in the society is the moment when people stop treating you like a person and they start treating you like an avatar or a reflection or a symbol of something else, good or bad. So when people see me on Power and Politics and they disagree with my stance and then they tweet at me, you stupid bitch, blah, 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 blah. They're not seeing me as a human being who's hearing those words and getting affected or hurt by them. They're seeing me as an avatar of the evil conservative agenda or the fascist or the blah, 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 blah. I've become in their heads a bogeyman, right? So that's what they're responding to. That's what they're tweeting at. They're not tweeting at a human being. They're tweeting at a bogeyman that exists in their own brains, right? I'm a reflection of all of their insecurities and their failings and their doubts and the evil that they think plagues the world. But that's what starts to happen to you when you start to increase in profile. You essentially, as more and more people follow you and listen to you, you actually become increasingly isolated.
Because people stop seeing you as human at that point. The more, it sounds like...
Yeah, exactly. The people who are tweeting at me and hate me most, they don't see me as a human being, right? With flaws and failings and blah, 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 blah. They see me as the person who got successful despite my stupidity and clearly taking up a space that's owed to them. And, I'm the bad guy that kept them out of blah, 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 blah. I mean, insert your pathology here. It really is. Or I'm an avatar of the woman who wouldn't sleep with them and blah, blah, or it's take your pick. That's how they see you. But Twitter only makes this worse. Twitter just makes this totally worse because it's like this effect on steroids.
Because there's so many people there. Right.
Yeah. Whereas without Twitter, I would be just somebody without Twitter, I'm just some nobody who goes on podcasts every once in a while. And I just wouldn't get exposed to those pathologies in the way that I do when I'm, wading through the ridiculous hellscape of that social media.
I'm curious, and in terms of, touching on the number of people and touching on the Dunbar number, do you think that you would have a different, let's say you were doing a public debate or something like that. Do you think in front of, let's say 300 people, do you think that you would end up being, people's comments would be different or people's questions would be different if they could have you in the room, let's say, even if it's in a big room, compared to if it was, 300 people that you're interacting with or that are interacting with a tweet of yours on Twitter? Do you think there's something inherent?
Yeah, I think that's probably an interesting hypothesis, but I think debate is probably the wrong analogy, because a debate is typically, two people standing in the front of a room lecturing to a large bunch of people. And I'm not sure the Dunbar number would come into effect in that kind of a scenario. But if you're having more of a lecture where there's a back and forth between people and a question and answer between people, my hypothesis would be that you should endeavor to keep that number below 150, because otherwise what I think you will see happen is that various cliques and tribes will form even in that kind of a limited social situation.
Mm-hmm. So you think that there's nothing, it's not inherent to the online medium, it's inherent to the number of people that you're interacting with, or that there's a dialogue going on?
What I would say is that it's both, right? I think that there's some limitations to human nature that come into play. I think we're fundamentally tribal creatures. I think we have a tendency to create in-groups and out-groups. I think we have a tendency to demonize others who are in the out-groups. And being aware of that element of our nature helps us to mitigate it. That said, there are aspects to things like social media that play upon these fundamental demons of our nature to make themselves irresistibly addictive to us. And Twitter is one of those mediums that do this in a very callous way. I mean, to some extent, Facebook is one as well, right? It plays on our tribalism in a way that ensures that we keep on going back for more validation and more fights and more abuse, because that's how we are increasingly defining ourselves and our tribes, if that makes sense.
Right, that's an interesting point. And I wonder, too, if you end up having, as you're suggesting, if online, it ends up kind of compounding the worser parts of our nature, because we also don't get any cues of humanity there. We're interacting with the screen. We're interacting with a tiny picture, or 180 characters or a few hundred characters, and so it can make it much easier to lose that sense of humanity. So even if we're going to think of the Dunbar number, maybe we think, okay, maybe there's 150 people that I could relate with on some level, but it's still harder to see someone as human when you're just interacting with a tiny image than when you see them, IRL in real life and get to see, their faces and their reactions, and then you can start to humanize them a little bit more. Do you think that plays in?
I think it's even worse than that. I think that these social media are effectively designed to play on the worst angels of our nature. Like they're designed to take advantage of like the root level tribalism and hatreds in order to keep us and I mean this, to keep us addicted, to keep us coming back to these media in order to create the communities that we're increasingly lacking in our real lives, right? Like that's the whole point of it, is that our real life communities and our real life relationships are all sort of breaking down. And so we go to Twitter for these things. We go to Facebook for these things. And they're designed to fulfill that human need at the deepest possible level, but they're also designed to play on and exploit the worst aspects of those needs for communities and tribalisms at the deepest level. Because otherwise, why would we care? Why would I keep on going back to Twitter in order to get abused? Well, it's providing me something, obviously. What's it providing me? Well, it's providing me community interaction with people who are like-minded. And most importantly, it's providing me with intellectual validation. When I tweet something smart and lots of people like it, right? Well, that obviously means that there's something lacking in my real life that I keep on relying on this stupid app, but I can't pull myself away from it. And I can't. Like, I'm totally addicted. I own that. But they're designed to be addictive. I mean, we've seen stuff. There's some recent magazine articles about Silicon Valley types who are having these big, moments of conscience when they realize that they've essentially designed the digital equivalent of slot machines. That's what these things are. They're slot machines. They're validation slot machines. Once you get hooked into them, you can't pull yourself away. So not only are they amplifying all of these terrible traits of human nature, they're feeding off of these terrible traits of human nature.
Yeah, I find it interesting when you'll see articles or you'll see interviews with the Silicon Valley types, the developers of some of these programs, and a lot of them don't allow their own children on them.
No, of course not, because they know exactly what they've created. They know the demons they've created. They've created a generation of slot addicts.
And what do you think is lacking? Because you're saying that these mediums are kind of taking over and feeding on our basest our baser instincts because there's something that's lacking in our daily lives. Do you think that? What do you think is lacking, and why do you think we're lacking something in terms of connection in our daily lives that we're feeding more and more and more into these online communities?
Well, I mean, here's where I'm just, spitballing, because I'm not an academic and I don't study these things, but, urbanization has an atomizing effect. We live in a culture that highlights and prioritizes individual needs and individualism, as opposed to collective identities and group identity. We've seen a massive breakdown in the church, which used to be one of the most socially cohesive elements at the community level that there used to be. We're no longer really spending time with our physical neighbors or friends. And attached to this is a sort of breakdown to the broader socially cohesive institutions that we used to rely on, from everything from, lack of trust in government to lack of trust in media to lack of trust in churches to lack of trust in blah, blah. It's all breaking down, right? The problem is that we're still fundamentally apes. We're great apes, and we're desperately social creatures. And we have biologically encoded good and bad qualities, and if you break down all of the things that have traditionally made societies cohesive and healthy, and sometimes also tribal and warlike. Those two things go hand in hand. But if you break down all of those things, it's not like the need goes away, right? Something else just needs to fill the need.
Right. And in the end, it seems like the thing that's created to fill the need ends up feeding into the problem, because the more we end up then interacting online to sort of replace, to sort of fill that void, the further it takes us away from our personal relationships, so our closer relationships. Because, and I think we've all been in this situation where, we may be sitting across, we may go out with some friends or even with our partners and be sitting across the table for them. And both of us or the other person may be tweeting something about it, or maybe taking a picture for Instagram, or maybe answering some messages while we're sitting together, because there's only so much time that there's only so much time there. So in the end, it seems like the thing that we're using to kind of fill that void is even making us less available for the, IRL, the real people that are in our lives that are more nourishing ways, let's say, to fill that social need.
And I know like the rebuttal to that argument is going to be like, well, you're still communicating with people, you're still developing those social networks, even if you're doing it through Facebook or through your phone. And I think that that's wrong. I think that there is something that is fundamentally degraded about digital communication as opposed to in real life communication, right? Like when you are sitting there physically with somebody, or even over a Skype call, for example, is a gross simulacra, but it doesn't replace one-on-one contact. I think that we need to be physically connected to one another. I mean, we can look at studies in the brain about the effects that a hug can have on you, and the way your oxytocin levels go up, and all of that kind of stuff. That we are primates who have evolved. This is what I think that's so funny, is that we're increasingly, as a diet fad, getting back to this idea of Paleolithic era diets, and yet we're doing this over our phones. Like if you're going to say that we need to be engaging in Paleolithic diets, then why wouldn't the need for a more Paleolithic model also extend to your social networks to some extent, right? Like if you think that we've gone fundamentally wrong in modern society, surely that extends to more than just food, right? like we seem to be lacking something here, and I think that digital communication or Facebook communication, because of its performative nature and because of its scaled nature, just isn't a replacement for the social communities, the close-knit social communities that we seem to have abandoned in the last several generations.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up the role of touch as well, because it's something that, primates do in terms of grooming each other. And then in terms of the personal relationships that we have, having touch, a hug releases endorphins, releases oxytocin. It is a way of creating that social bonding. And in fact, even in terms of, the amygdala activation, in terms of the fight, flight, kind of freeze reflex that goes off, the panic reflex in the brain, touch, kind of firm touch, even the type of touch you would give a baby, like, a tight squeeze, swaddling, rocking back and forth, physical presence of somebody else, those things are soothing to us when we're in a panic state. And it's just something that at this point, Twitter and our online interaction just really can't replace.
No, and I mean, and what's soothing about Twitter? What's soothing about Instagram? What's soothing about Facebook? All of these things are fundamentally driven by a desire to demonstrate status and dominance over our friends, as opposed to a desire to create community and connection. That's the problem, is that these social media networks are giving us the illusion of community and connection, but what's keeping us addicted to them is a desire for status demonstration and status.
Right. And a sense of, and it can tap into a sort of sense of fundamental loneliness and isolation. So even, status, absolutely. And also just a sense of, as you were saying earlier, that we want to have a tribe, that we want to have a sense of community, that we want to have a lot of likes and hearts and little smileys that start appearing in our feed to feel like, to sort of fill that void of connection.
I say, and one of the most corrosive aspects of this whole online phenomena is that the more isolated and lonely you get, the more you go for the easiest possible and shallowest level of human connection, and that is typically through your computer screen. So you go into Reddit communities or you go into Twitter. And the real problem with this is that you wind up in these sort of intellectual rabbit holes with other people and with other sort of people who are of a like mind. And sometimes these intellectual rabbit holes or these little online communities are very benign. You're all into bird watching, you're all into photography. That's the internet as its most constructive. But I think that what we're increasingly seeing is that people are getting sucked into very destructive rabbit holes. So the alt-right, for example, or the incel movement, which I think is basically a death cult, to extreme politics, both on the left and the right, politics that seeks to just fundamentally destroy everything about our society and everything that makes, our modern lives good. Right, all of these sorts of groupthinks, these mini cults, essentially, are starting up online, and they're fulfilling that need for community and tribalism that is just, again, lacking in our everyday real life. So it's not benign. None of this is benign, is what I would say.
Well, and I wonder what you think about the effect that this may be having on the younger generation. Because, in terms of our cohort, yes, our, interacting online has been prominent in our lives, but we didn't grow up with it. Sort of started hitting more in our teens and started gradually picking up. But we didn't start off with this in young childhood. And I wonder what the effect is going to be for the next generation. And let me just bracket this with, of course, the observation that with any new technology or new-ish technology, there's always the older farts. Sorry, I'm going to include us in that group, even though I'm sure we're both young and wonderful, but for this purpose, we're old farts. That anytime there's a newish technology, there's going to be a group of people that are going to freak out about it and say, oh, kids these days, and what's going to happen, and think of the children and think of the next generation. And that happened with, printed books, and that happened with radio, and that happened with TV and with video games. So this may also just be the next thing for, older people to start freaking out about. But that said, it's really pernicious and it's really taking over. What do you think is going to be the effect in terms of, kids that are growing up in this atmosphere?
Yeah, well, I think people who rely on that criticism often gloss over the fact that there were social consequences for things like the printing press, and not all the social consequences were good. Right. On the whole, books were great. I'm all for books, but like in the centuries after the Gutenberg press, there were massive social upheavals and a fundamental reorganization of society around written literacy that led to some negative consequences for society as a whole. I mean, it's not so. I mean, here's where I'm getting way out of my history here, but if I'm vaguely recalling, like the 17th century slanders and libels that were bandied about neighbors and communities, when printing became really cheap and easy, is roughly analogous to what we're seeing now with social media, right? It wasn't all good and positive. In the long term, it sorted itself out, sure, but that took some centuries, took some doing. The creation of the Guten Press and the free information and the easier flow of relatively affordable information was associated with all sorts of social upheavals and fundamental breakdowns in social cohesion. And as I said, it didn't just fix itself in the span of 10 years. I mean, some of the consequences for that took centuries to play out. So, I'm not saying that social media isn't going to be a good thing or the internet isn't going to be a good thing in the long run. It probably will, but it's naive for us to expect that there aren't going to be some very serious short-term and medium-term consequences for the way that we're shifting the way that we're shifting society and the way that we're shifting our relationships with one another as a result of it. And what are the short-term consequences for my kid? Well, I'm a 34-year-old woman who didn't grow up addicted to the internet, and I'm a happily married woman with a kid now, and I can still tell you bald-faced that I'm addicted to Twitter and that I outsource too much of my validation to it, and that I suffer anxiety problems as a result of Twitter. And I'm more grounded and successful than a lot of people. I'm very lucky. So there are consequences to these choices. The other thing I would say is what I'm concerned about for my kid is I'm concerned that he's going to grow up in an era where all of his sense of self-worth and validation will be external, right? Where he's going to grow up in a world where his sense of his value and his place in society has been outsourced to digital corporations, essentially, right?
Right.
I think that's extraordinarily dangerous because, we all know that I think one of the key indicators of mental health and a functioning person in society is your ability to have not just self-esteem, that's a shallow way of putting it, but a sense of your own value that is intrinsic to who you are as a person and not easily swayed by, whether or not a bunch of people unfriend you one day. You have to have a value in your own worth and what you produce in the world and what you do in the world that is disconnected from the way people respond to you. And that's a really hard thing to develop. It doesn't just happen overnight. It happens as a result of creating mastery in your world and developing things of value in the world and being a good person and being a moral person and doing all these sorts of things. And if you're outsourcing all of that validation to Facebook likes and Instagram posts and Instagram likes and Twitter likes and your Twitter following, I mean, it's all external validation. It's all things that can be taken away from you, right? So then what happens to your mental health when all of that external validation falls out from under you? Because eventually it does.
Well, and so far it seems like in terms of the statistics that for teens and young adults, that the directions have been pretty scary in terms of mental health. In terms of, on some levels it seems positive. So younger people are getting into less mischief in the real world. So there's, lower, children aren't having teenagers aren't having sex as young or as much of it, or engaging as many risky behaviors, as much drug use, as much crime. But there's also a lot more internalizing problems. So dramatic increases in anxiety and depression and suicidality that have been going on.
So here's my question. Is it such a good thing that teenagers aren't having as much sex? Is it such a good thing that teenagers aren't going out and drinking and socializing and doing drugs? I mean, we all know that there are downsides to teenage sex, and we all know there are downsides to teenage drinking and drugs, and that those problems can become pathological. But you can't necessarily detach these quote-unquote unsociable or undesirable behaviors from the very necessary things that teenagers do when they differentiate, create social networks, go out, develop romantic relationships, experiment with their sexuality, and do all of these really positive, developmentally necessary things as well. So, I don't think it's a good sign that teenagers aren't having as much sex. I think that that's a really bad sign.
Well, let's just try not to take that quote out of context and spread it online then.
Yeah, well, I know I'm going to have a fun day on Twitter when this comes out, isn't it?
No, but I think you're touching on something really important too, which is that through our interactions in real life, even in terms of things that we may have seen as potentially problematic or things that parents wouldn't want their teenagers doing, like being promiscuous or like drug use or getting into, petty crimes, it does give the opportunity to be able to learn from your experiences, to be able to experience different types of consequences, and most importantly, to be able to read people in real life, to be able to read people's social communications, to be able to have the experience of being manipulated by someone in front of you and know what that feels like, to have the experience of being able to say something hurtful and look at the person's face and see how it affects them. And I think even for myself, and I'd like to view myself as, a kind and moralistic person, but I've definitely done some horrible things and some hurtful things to people in my life. And the only way that I realized it was by being able to, in real life, see the effect it had on them and be able to really reflect on it, and then be able to double back and say, oh my goodness, I am so sorry. And those are the experiences that have marked me the most. Whereas anything I've written online, there's not the same simultaneity, there's not the same social cues, and I wonder for kids that are growing up in this, if they're going to be able to have those experiences, to be able to read people the same ways, to be able to learn from the consequences of their social interactions the same ways, other than having this kind of delayed sort of, extreme reaction.
Or whether or not we're essentially creating a group of kids who are going to be digital sociopaths. People who do have the underlying structure to be empathetic, warm, caring human beings, but are simply never trained or taught how to be those things early enough in life for it to be useful. So that would be my fear. And I don't know if I'm just theorizing here. I'm just spitballing. Again, I'm not an academic. I don't research in these areas. But those would be the things that I'd be scared about.
Yeah. Well, I think, time will tell. We're going to find out. Because the other direction we can also see it going is that, the brain is extremely plastic in early development. And so it may be that for kids that are inundated with this stuff, that their brains will start to wire a little bit differently, and they may start to be able to swim in these waters with greater ease than we do.
I think that's probably true. But as I said, kind of going back to the Gutenberg analogy, I don't think that we're going to see either the full upside or the full downside to our digital revolution for another generation or two. I think that the upheaval and the digital revolution is still nascent. It's still in its early stages, and it's going to be a generation or two, if not three, before we really start to see how our reliance on technology, and essentially how our reliance on technology to get our social needs met, and increasingly some of our physical needs, for example, like sex, how that changes us as a species or doesn't. The jury's going to be out on that one for a really long time.
Absolutely. And let me just ask you one more question as we're getting into, we were touching at the beginning in terms of, the political sides that we may be on, or the things that we want to advocate. Online platforms have been, on the one hand, have really helped a lot of social movements and have really helped move things forward, get a message out, really mobilize people, and sort of unite people. But on the other hand, as you were mentioning as well, that within these groups, we tend to also kind of vilify each other. So even if we're on the same side, we'll kind of start picking on each other and dogpiling one on the other. How do you think the best way is to navigate a balance between that, where you can really use, on the one hand, some of the power of social media to be able to unite people and get a message across, while also not kind of going down the rabbit hole of just further extremism and vilification?
Okay, so I would kind of challenge the premise of the question.
Sure.
What social movements has social media started in a positive way that hasn't ended in total collapse or schismatic mess? Because look, you've got the Arab Spring. Well, that ended in a bunch of reinstatement of a couple of dictators and civil war in certain places that now has been ongoing for 10 years.
Absolutely.
There's Me Too, which, by the way, I'm a total supporter of the Me Too movement. I think it's a really important conversation that needed to happen. But right now we're starting to see that turn. Let's see, the Women's March. I don't know if you just saw what just came out in front of the Women's March, but now the co-founders of the Women's March are turning against one another, and that movement seems to be falling into a schismatic mess. And throughout all of these things, I'm seeing the same types of social dynamics play out, where you create these kind of almost cult-like dynamics forming, where these movements are intolerant of dissent. They're intolerant of people within their movements sort of questioning the premises of the movements, and you kind of have more purity testing and more performative social media grandstanding. And also, I think more dangerously even, what you get is slacktivism, right? You get people who are signing a change.org position or tweeting the right hashtag for performative reasons or sharing the right thing on Facebook. And then all of a sudden, sort of like your social obligations to progress and change have now been absolved, because you did this thing online that had no real effect on the real world. You aren't being forced to actually go volunteer. You aren't being forced to actually work with people of need in your actual real life communities, because you're allowing yourselves to be morally absolved to your obligations to the people in the communities by your online work. Even if much of it, I think it winds up dissipating a lot of positive energy. So I mean, I'm not super convinced that social media is a great platform for broad movement. I think it almost seems to create as many problems as it addresses.
Well, it seems to be able to at least get things going. This seems to get off the rails pretty quickly, but it gets a lot of people going. And it seems like my impression is that.
But again, what are the examples of that? What has it gotten going exactly?
Well, even when you're saying the Arab Spring, Me Too movement, if you look at Pantsuit Nation, they've done a lot of work in terms of trying to translate this sort of online cohesion into getting out the vote and getting people to be mobilized and go out and actually do it, and then start to share a bunch of pictures of themselves voting in the U.S. elections. And it seems in that way that potentially it was effective.
Okay, but is there any actual evidence that Pantsuit Nation was I've never heard of this. Was there any actual evidence that Pantsuit Nation was effective in actually mobilizing voters? Because that's the other problem that I have with a lot of this stuff. But if you look at how the politics sausage gets made, most of the actual mobilization and get out the vote stuff is still being done at the party level. Right? It's people who are being identified as supporters and voters, then being contacted and motivated to vote by the actual respective parties. I mean, social media has been very, very effective and useful for people who want to manipulate social behavior, right? And I would say, I think the voter turnout on the midterms has been historically high, but it was historically high on both the liberal and the Republican side. I mean, there was a reason why the Democrats couldn't take the Senate. even though it was if there were any environment for which they should have been able to take the Senate and have a huge blowout in the House, this should have been it. But it mobilized as many Republicans as it did Democrats. So like I'm not convinced that social media has been effective at actually mobilizing any real serious change in any meaningful way that hasn't wound up having weird schismatic backlash effects.
Or sort of imploding on itself in the end.
Or ultimately just imploding on itself in the end. I mean, as I said, the one big exception to this I would probably say is Me Too. I think it's been sort of a positive opening of a set of conversations about, particularly around norms for men and women in the workplace. But there's almost, at the same time, there's been a backfire effect against Me Too, which may actually wind up being more regressive toward female norms in the workplace in the long run. So I'm really increasingly skeptical about the value of social media in terms of fomenting positive social change.
All right, Jen. So let me ask you then, what do you think the way forward is here? Because it seems like a pretty dire state and seems like, things may just be getting worse. So then do we just burn it all down, throw out all our Facebook and Twitter accounts, burn down social media and start back over in terms of just, interpersonal relationships or tribal, actual real life interactions? Or is there another way forward here?
Well, I think things are about to get burned down, whether we like it or not. As I said, I think that we're at the beginning of a digital revolution that's going to take a couple of generations to pan out. So I suspect things are going to. So the first step is I do think that on the policy level, we need to have a conversation with Silicon Valley about what they are actually producing and to what extent they are consciously trying to create technologies that are addictive for us. And there may be some role for government regulation in starting to counteract that. But I think that ultimately what's going to happen is we're going to create enough problems for ourselves in society with these technologies that there's going to be a backlash to them to some extent. You already kind of see this with people in public positions, getting off Twitter and getting off Facebook and completely abandoning social media as a cesspool and just not engaging in that anymore. So that's going to be one strategy. I don't really know what the answers to this is going to be, but I hope that people sort of take a real hard look at sort of the way that they're using these technologies and allowing these technologies to control their lives as individuals and finding ways to balance that out and balance out the good these technologies can do with the fact that, we as humans have some real basic needs that we fundamentally need to meet in a real life physical environment. And that, if your technology use isn't an extension of a healthy lifestyle and a healthy social dynamic in real life, that it can so easily take over your life and become something that you abuse and become addicted to.
And that then takes away from, the real life interactions and the valuable things that we have going on day to day. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for this conversation, Jen. This was really fascinating getting into all this, and I really appreciate the perspectives that you shared today.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
So, Sam, let's begin with the health angle. We dealt with this in depth on the bullying episode, but how often are you seeing a social media component to kids' mental health issues?
I think it actually comes up quite a bit. And in terms of the research, something I was touching on in the podcast before is that there seems to be this dramatic increase since the iPhone reached over 50%, of use in terms of young people about several years ago. You're seeing this dramatic increase in anxiety, in depression, in suicidality, in self-harm. And there's a thought that these things may be related. And there's been some direct research showing that when people do interact with Facebook, and particularly the more visual media like Instagram and Snapchat, that it does tend to give, a pretty dramatic drop in mood. And in fact, even in my practice, I'll see this a lot with clients where they'll say, I think we all have a tendency to get into a bit of the grass is greener, thinking that our neighbors or other people have it better than us, or that are somehow more together, look better, feel better. And I think that a lot of social media just really amplifies this. So I'll have clients coming in, teenagers teenagers, adults that will be saying that, they're feeling isolated, they're feeling like they don't have friends, and they'll start to mention their Facebook feeds and their Instagram feeds and say, yeah, I saw my friends at a party together that I wasn't invited at, and they look so happy. Or I see them out for dinner with each other and they're smiling and I'm not included in this. They're having this great time and I'm just miserable and alone in the dark. And so it seems like it is having this kind of effect on their mental health in terms of how they perceive themselves and how isolated they feel. And even beyond that, I've had some clients who have, decided to, we speak about limiting social media time. And I've had some clients who have decided their own volition to just stop Facebook or stop Twitter or delete their Instagram accounts for temporary times. And almost inevitably, even when it's not something we've discussed before, when they say that they've done it, they come in right afterwards saying that they're generally feeling better, that they tend to feel a bit of a mood lift and that they tend to feel a bit more connected and they're not sort of falling down that rabbit hole of comparing themselves to others.
Are you sold on Dunbar's theory? Does the size of the network make it inherently more toxic as it grows? It's interesting with Dunbar's number because it's actually a series of numbers. We tend to talk about the 150, which is the number of people that we can call casual friends. But then it tends to go in these multiples of 3. So whereas 50 may be people we call close friends, 15 is the people 15 may be the number of people we can turn to sympathy when we need it, and 5 may be our really close support group, like our besties, our really close family. But the group can extend to 500, acquaintance level, or 1,500, which may be the absolute limit of people that we can put, a name to their faces. Now, do I think that this pertains to social media, and what buy-in do I have with it? Meh. There's some interesting research on it, kind of supporting Dunbar's number. There's some interesting ideas around it. I think I'm not sure in terms of the exact number and the exact multiples and how much that pertains or how valid that is. But there's some suggestive research. And I think that there is a certain intuitive sense that, the fewer the people that you interact with, the easier it is to keep them in mind and to know them, to really know them and predict how they're going to feel, how they're going to react, understand when they're posting something, for example, that they're being sarcastic or that they're being ironic and not to take it literally. Whereas if it's somebody that's more distantly related to you or someone that's a stranger online that just happens to be in your Twitter feed, then you may not know what their intentions are. And it's a lot harder to kind of humanize them and to really see that when they're posting a comment, that what they're doing is that they're making a joke, that they're being ironic or sarcastic. And so I think that, there's some interesting ideas in there in terms of Dunbar number. I'm not sure in terms of the actual fixed number, but I think that there is definitely an intuitive sense that, the more people that you're interacting with, the harder it is to evidently just to know them. We just don't have that much time to be besties with 1,500 people or 2,000 people. How do you think we should all balance a free exchange of ideas necessary in a democracy with being conscious of the mental health of some of our political opponents on social media?
I think it's important to really think of when we're engaging online particularly, we want to think of why am I posting this right now? Why do I need to do this? And secondarily, will it be effective in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish? Frankly, I think asking ourselves those two questions in terms of almost everything we do is a pretty good idea. Why am I doing this? Will it be effective? But particularly when we're thinking in terms of engaging in democracy and, having meaningful dialogue in terms of within our political parties and across political parties, before we start to dogpile on somebody, when somebody makes a given comment, whether they're part of our tribe or they're part of our out group, maybe they're part of our political leaning, they agree with our political leanings generally, or they're on, Jean, the other side of the aisle, that we want to think, when I'm posting this comment, why am I doing this? Am I doing this to punish the person? Am I doing this to hurt the person? And, and you may think, well, maybe is that the type of person I want to be? Do I want to be someone to punish and hurt someone else? And maybe you think, well, or you may ask yourself, well, why am I doing this? Okay, well, I want to persuade the other person. Okay, well, that could be valid. Or I want to open a dialogue. Well, is calling the person, pardon my language, a bitch or an asshole, or saying that they should, that you wish they would die or be raped, is that really going to be effective in terms of opening a political dialogue and really getting ideas across and convincing people. So I think that could be a really nice place to start in terms of when we're getting into these dialogues online, is really thinking, why am I doing this and will it be effective? And secondarily, maybe just to give people the benefit of the doubt a little bit, that when people do post something, recognize that you don't have tone, you don't have context, you don't know this person. And so when they're posting things without those other cues, it's easy to misinterpret the message that they're trying to get across. And so sometimes silence is the best response. And just to consider that.
And that'll do it for today's show. Join us next time for another episode of The Goldwaters. You can listen to past episodes at thegoldwaters.ca and join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter, #TheGoldwaters. And you can now hear us on the iHeartRadio app in both Canada and the US, by the way. We're looking to hear directly from you, the listeners, so do email us anytime with your thoughts at talk@thegoldwaters.ca and tell us what you think about this or other shows. I'm Dan Delmar. See you next time, Goldwaters.
This has been a production of TNKI Media. Good talk.